Facebook was more important. Twitter was a small number of consumers in the zeros of the last decade, but Facebook was actually quite important in places like Tunisia and so forth. I think the social media has been exaggerated as a form of protest and organization that allowed the youth to take on these dictators in 2010, 2011, 2012. But it had its place. It allowed, first of all, it was an outlet. So the newspapers were all censored. Well, you couldn't exactly complain about the regime in Tunisia if the president's son-in-law owned all the major newspapers, and that was the case. So there wasn't a place to write op-eds, to criticize. Even how would you get the word out if you wanted to have a demonstration? Your phones were tapped. Even your email was often hacked. There were government cyber units that were spying on activists. But Facebook, you could put out a notice that there's going to be a big protest on such and such date. Everybody come there. So, this happens sometimes for frivolous purposes in the West, that people deliberately or inadvertently create what's called a flash mob. Some people will say, well, let's all meet at the mall on Saturday at 4. And somehow this will go viral, and way too many people meet at the mall, so it becomes a security issue. Sometimes there are stampedes and people get injured. But some of the Middle East activists, the youth, began deliberately creating flash mobs and as protest against the regime. And the regime had these laws. Like in Egypt, there was a law that no more than 5 people could be in a public space together, or police would come. And so one of the first protests they did was they spaced people out to meet the letter of the law. So there was this long line of people, but they weren't, all in one place. But then through social media, they were able to arrange for flash mobs. And that was the opposite tactic, which is that they just overwhelmed the police. The police couldn't deal with so many people showing up, or at least couldn't easily deal with it. So they developed a repertoire of protest, but it wasn't just electronic activism. They did the tried and true methods of organization. They walked neighborhoods. And Egyptian activists, youth, they told me this. They said, we just went to people's doors. We went upstairs in the apartment buildings knocking on doors. And if we got a positive response, and we pamphleteered, they would print off, 100,000 pamphlets and send them around. If we got a positive response when we went to a door, we'd note that down. So we made a record of a kind of a geography of protest that we kept with us. And then they said, you shouldn't ignore just word of mouth. Something on the order of, I can't remember, maybe half of the people who came to Tahrir Square, the major square in downtown Cairo, to protest, were just called by friends. So it wasn't SMS texting, or it wasn't Facebook, it wasn't Twitter. It was just their friends saying, hey, have you heard what's going on? Would you like to come down and join us? Then they would chant as they marched. So they would start in one part of Cairo and march to the downtown square. Well, as they were going, they would chant. Sometimes they would chant, we're going to Tahrir, so it would let everybody know where they should gather. And they told me that people on their balconies would take up the chant, because Cairo's like New York, it's very dense, and people are out on their balconies hanging laundry or whatever it might be. And so if you shout, people will hear you, and then if they'll shout and join in, and then it reverberates to the whole neighborhood. So these kinds of local, corporeal, and kinetic activities in the real world were not so visible, I think, to outside observers, because you could always go do a search on Facebook and see what was going on, and a lot of people were posting in both Arabic and English, so Western journalists had special access to those things, even if they weren't in Egypt. But they couldn't see the neighborhood organizing or the neighborhood marching or the neighborhood chanting, the kinds of everyday things that people were doing that made this movement so successful. One of the innovations the youth came up with was to stage a long-term sit-in. They just brought tents, and they staged it in the main artery of the city. So Tahrir Square is the kind of place where all the taxi drivers have to go through it at some point to get somewhere. It's the way the city is laid out. It was laid out, the modern part of the city was laid out in imitation of Baron Haussmann's Paris. So these traffic circles, which also exist, say, in Washington, D.C. But what it means is that you have a lot of traffic coming into the circle and going out of it. And so if you close down that traffic circle, it paralyzes the city. And that traffic circle is huge, and it's near to the main government building, so it also threatens the functioning of the government, even of the army. And so they went to this main square, and they encouraged people to do this in all the cities of Egypt, and just pitched tents and stayed. And there were logistics involved. They had to steal electricity for their microphones. They set up stages. It's kind of like a rock concert. And there was music and poetry, but also haranguing and speeches. And I saw some of this with my own eyes. They had to arrange for food to come in, and a lot of restaurateurs or merchants were supporting the movement and would send food in. Famously, there was a Kentucky Fried Chicken establishment in downtown Cairo that was servicing mainly the tourists. And of course, it had to close because of the protests. But the Egyptian government at one point put in the main Egyptian government organ, Al Ahram newspaper, that the protesters were only coming downtown to get free Kentucky Fried Chicken. That was what was really going on. So the government became increasingly less credible by saying things like this. And at one point, then the government tried to cut off the internet because they became convinced that it was important in allowing people to organize. But it backfired on them because the young people who weren't going out to protest had friends who were. But they knew their friends were okay. They knew what was happening because people were communicating on internet, and you could see it even on satellite TV sometimes. But then when the government cut off the internet, they didn't know. Are their friends? Are their brothers and sisters? Are they all right? So they had to go down. So it just caused the crowds to mushroom. Well, if you stay in these squares for 2 weeks, after a while, nothing happening in the country. Nobody's making any money. The shops are not open. The government's not working. In some instances, like the city of Alexandria, which is a northern port, very important to Egypt's economy and administration, basically seceded from the country. There was no government there, and the Egyptian government can't afford to have these things happen. So it was a kind of blackmail of the elite in a way that the youth were saying, we're going to go on doing this until that guy is gone. And unfortunately for the government, the army signaled fairly early on that it wasn't going to allow itself to be used to disperse the crowds. The Army Chief of Staff came on television and said, we're not going to fire on the Egyptian people. We are the Egyptian people. So the dictator had no lever. The secret police were with him, some of the municipal police, and there were about 900 people killed, youth. But this was a movement of millions. So without the army being willing to intervene, there was no way to clear these squares. And then as time went on, more and more people were being disadvantaged, and people were chanting. So when the protests first began on January 25th of 2011, I think a lot of people in the Egyptian elite felt, well, Mubarak got me here. The dictator got me here. He's the one who threw that license to me that I could make money. He's the one who let me know about the sweet deal on the privatized corporation. He's the one who promoted me in his national party. So that's ridiculous that we should, just because a bunch of teenagers are shouting in the street, that we would let him go. He's the pillar of our politics. But then after about 3 weeks, those same people were starting to think, well, I'm not making any money and things look pretty dire for the country. And how well do I really like that guy? Maybe we should let him go. And then even his international backers began thinking that way. And of course, famously, President Barack Obama, late in the process, called up Mubarak and said, "Old man, you just have to go." But it was the army who gave him a push. The army more or less made a coup at the request of the youth in the crowds in the street. Well, they weren't asking for a coup, but they were asking that Mubarak be gone. So the army got rid of him, and then they came in and tried to guide the political process after that. This was a very unfortunate development, as it turns out, because initially the army didn't want to be too involved in everyday politics, and it was happy enough to let, a new prime minister come in, go to elections, try to let the civil parties settle things. Although it always did, engage in some crackdowns. Thousands of protesters were arrested by the army and tried in military courts, and there were subsidiary protests about that. But in the summer of 2012, the worst possible thing happened, which was that there was a presidential election, and the two candidates, one was from Mubarak's old cabinet. He had been Mubarak's last vice president and was an Air Force officer. And so he was the old regime. And the other candidate was Muslim Brotherhood, which was the religious fundamentalist party, the Egyptian religious right. And a lot of the youth were very upset that this was their choice. This wasn't what they were going for at all. A lot of them were relatively secular-minded people. They didn't want a religious state. They didn't want Iran, on the one hand, but they couldn't vote for somebody who was a crony of Mubarak. And so a lot of people stayed home. A lot of people were upset, and the Muslim Brotherhood candidate won because at least he wasn't the old regime. And then he started acting high-handedly. I'm not defending what was done to him. Really, Egypt got derailed after that. But ultimately, he alienated, I think, most of the population. There were millions of people on the street against him within a year. And the army took advantage of this to make a coup.